Hello and welcome to this week's Granny's Garden. Now this week it's another how-to video, and this week we're having a look at how to transplant successfully an established holly bush. Now in actual fact I on my own property don't have a holly bush, but on the other side of the fence my neighbour does. So I'm going to be lending her a helping hand today in ensuring a successful transplant. Transplanting mature holly shrubs can be notoriously difficult, and the actual transplant can kill them, or the transplant shock can kill them. And we're talking about a shrub here that's about 15 plus years old. So we're going to be looking at today what I can do, or what we can do, to ensure every success or survival. Right, well here I am in my neighbour's garden, and this is the actual shrub in question. It's about 6 foot, 6.5 foot high, and was actually bought as a tiny little plug plant. So it has grown quite a bit. Now it is a bit sparse, it's in the sunlight now, but in actual fact it spends most of its day in the shade, and it was completely surrounded by hydrangeas, some of which have been lifted and others have cut back. Now my neighbour, what she wants to do is the whole area here dedicated to mophead or macrophylla hydrangeas, so she wants this moved. Now the general consensus is it's best to move holly shrubs in early spring because it lessens the chance of transplant shock. However, there is a chance also of doing it in early fall, although of course the risk of transplant shock increases. What do I do? Well, actually neither of the two of them. I do it as a two-part. So now at the end of September, beginning of October, which is like early fall, what I do is come in with first part. And I'm going to show you now what I do. Now for transplanting this holly bush, I'm going to have to establish a drip line, and I'm going to show you why in a minute. Unlike a tree, which has a wider canopy at the top and narrow at the bottom, a shrub, in this case it's a holly shrub, is narrow at the top and wider at the base. But I don't want to establish the drip line right at the tips, because in actual fact you see there is sort of like a true drip line here. It's almost a line there, and then there's these stragglers. So I'm going to forget about the little stragglers and sort of drop down this true line, which is more dense, and then drop it onto the ground, and that is where I'm going to establish my perimeter for cutting. Now for those newer gardeners, very quickly, a drip line is basically imagining the widest part of your shrub or a tree, the canopy of your tree if you're talking about a tree. You talk about the widest part and imagine it's an umbrella, and if there's water or rain falling on top of it, the water runs off, reaches the edge and then drops onto the ground, and where it drips onto the ground, that is your drip line. And that's the area we're going to be using as our perimeter for today's work. Before you start transplanting any type of plant, but particularly shrubs or trees, it is very important to know what type of root system it has. If you don't know it by heart, and you're not going to know everything because there's far too many plants, do some research, Google it. In the case of the holly bush or holly shrub, the roots are very shallow but very extensive. So there's going to be no taproot, but there is, after 15 years plus growing, going to be a very large extended root system. So now with that knowledge we can get going. Now in part one of this transplant, which I always do in fall, early autumn, what I'm going to do is not move it at all. What I'm going to do is along that drip line, I'm going to slice through those extensive root systems. I've got loppers with me, I've got my spearhead spade, and I'm going to make a nice circumference or perimeter around that drip line. And then what I'm going to do as my special added tip, I'm going to put some rooting hormone, shake it inside those little roots that have been cut. And that way I'm going to stimulate new feather roots growing on what's left of the root ball. And then I'm going to cover it in again, and I'm going to very clearly mark where that perimeter is. So when I come back again next March to do part 2, and I lift it with inside that drip line, there's going to be lots and lots of feathery new roots, which is going to vastly help the success of that transplant. Now this is the one I'm going to be using. It's a natural root stimulator basically, but you can really use any type of hormone or any type of stimulator you want. It comes in little sachets. It's like a granular powder type thing, and I'm just going to gently, inside this gap, sprinkle it the full perimeter, and then when it's done I'm just going to cover it in as if it had never been touched at all. I'm just covering this really well at the surface because they do have a dog and I don't want the dog licking this rooting stimulant. So I'm just covering it really well and tamping it down, and that way the rooting hormone remains underground at a safe distance from the dog. Now as soon as you water it, the rest will start closing in and any air pockets will disappear. But that is this first part done. Now all I need to do is get some pebbles and mark where that drip line is, because when I come back next February or March, preferably March, I need to know where that drip line is so I can go just inside it with a spade to be able to lift it. Because the last thing I want to do is to damage the new roots I'm going to stimulate now. That would be counterproductive. So I mark where the area is. If this is the drip line I have, I'm just going to mark it just outside, so when I come in next March, I know that I just go just inside the pebbles and make a line. Now, considering that this particular holly bush is over 15 years old, I'm a little bit worried the fact that the root system is not as extensive as it should be. However, forge forward, and it's got a lot of root stimulator around it. Hopefully over the next few months now it's going to grow a lot of feather roots and a lot of new roots in general. That makes my life a lot easier when in March of next year I come back and lift the plant in its entirety and put it in a new location. Obviously, that's going to be part 2, and I'm going to take you along on that journey come March of next year. So watch this space. Meantime, I'm going to hop back to my own side of the fence and get some work done in my own garden. And I look forward to seeing you next week with me over the fence in Granny's garden. Bye-bye now.
Hola, Nela. Eres niña guapa. Sentada. Sentada.